We left Madame Lalaurie with her young husband Louis, having just acquired the property at what is now 1140 Royal Street. The townhouse was not yet complete, but the building looked more like this drawing than the modern building at this address. Remember, the house burned, and there were only 2 stories at the time. Before we finish exploring the documented story of Delphine, I want to examine our fixation on antebellum stories as the basis of our horror and ghost fetish in the modern times. While I was searching for portraits of Delphine and her 3 husbands, I found this book, Tales from the Haunted South, Dark Tourism, and Memories of Slavery from the Civil War Era by Tiya Miles. Dr. Miles analyzes the story of Delphine, as well as Carolyn Morrow's interpretation of the evidence and the modern conception of the story through ghost tours. She points out that we wouldn't have ghost tours of the 9/11 memorial, as that would be considered distasteful by all. Indeed, Mary Millen is one of the figures in Long's book who conducts a seance and claims to speak with the ghosts of the enslaved people who died there in the epilogue. She calls herself Bloody Mary, as well as a priestess and queen of voodoo. She was also widely criticized in 2018 for creating the Haunted History Museum and a tour she holds of an apartment where a gruesome murder-suicide occurred in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. But this tour still exists in a city where friends of the victims still live. In my research, I have noticed over and over again that the figures who still captivate our attention hundreds of years later all knew each other. Pontalba, Almonaster, the Lafitte brothers, Marie Laveau, Père Antoine, and Delphine Lalaurie all lived in the same New Orleans. All of the stories come from the same half-century or so when people were allowed to own other people of African descent. And much of the horror in the stories focuses specifically on the violence against the enslaved, violence that is not legally possible today. In a world where the common story was once one of genteel dominance that did not involve violence through lost-cause efforts at rewriting history, we have swung to fetishizing the violence against Black and brown bodies in the past, while distancing ourselves from the violence of today. Dr. Miles points out that this is a form of othering. We can remove ourselves from the violence of the past because we do not allow that behavior now. While we can tolerate the cruelty and horror because it is not possible now, the same way that Delphine is always described as Creole and not just white or American, enslavers are other than us, the civilized people of today. I am guilty of this in my own retelling. In the first part of this story, I always describe Delphine as Creole, which in Delphine's time would have meant someone who was born in Louisiana to parents who were born elsewhere. This is another rewriting of the facts, as Dr. Miles points to numerous sources in the evidence that show that Creole women weren't particularly cruel toward those they enslaved. White women, in general, were. As I pointed out in part 1, white women, Creole or not, were violent by all evidence. It was not abnormal at all. Delphine is doubly othered in the ghost story to make her mad and Creole, and definitely not like the other slavers. But the truth is she was just like the other slavers. Dr. Miles also carefully points out that the crowds that destroy the Lalaurie mansion are described simply as being of all classes and colors in the newspaper accounts. It's unlikely that other high society slave-owning white people destroyed her residence because they could not tolerate her crimes. We have plenty of evidence that they were guilty of the same or similar crimes, including in the contemporary accounts that describe the crowds being stopped by the sheriff to prevent the same destruction of more slave owners. More likely, it was abolitionists who expressed their outrage. Abolition was gaining momentum in the North around the time of the fire. In the Boston Post, we get this account. Quote, "The mob assembled again on Friday night with a view to complete their work of destruction and to wreak their vengeance on other persons accused of being guilty of similar conduct to that of Madame Lalaurie." But the authorities were on the watch, the alarm was given, and a part of the Legion and the U.S. troops were soon under arms and on the field of action. Mr. Holland, the deputy sheriff, read the riot act to the crowd, which soon dispersed and perfect order has been restored, and we hope may never again be disturbed by a like impolitic and dangerous movement not to be excused in this city, even by the scandalous outrages that gave rise to it." Unquote. With this in mind, let's continue the story of Delphine and why her story has lasted through time. The townhouse at the corner of Hospital and Royal Streets was always in her name in the records. She and Louis lived there until 1832, when Delphine petitioned for a separation from Lalaurie, and it was granted. From letters one of her neighbors sent to his family in France, we learned that Delphine's marriage to Louis was notoriously unhappy. One of her claims in the separation petition was, quote, "On the 26th of October last, 1832, in the presence of many witnesses, the said Louis Lalaurie went so far as to not only ill-treat her, but even to beat and wound her in the most outrageous and cruel manner." Unquote. It seems that perhaps her vicious nature was not only common among white women, but white men as well. Dr. Miles posits that the protection of white men from the historical narrative of cruelty as represented in stories like Delphine's is a way of maintaining the paternalistic and patriarchal hierarchy of antebellum times. In some accounts of the torture at the Lalaurie mansion, history has rewritten the story again so that the doctor was experimenting on those he enslaved, leading to the appearance of torture. After Delphine separated from him, Louis went on to live in a rural Plaquemines parish, and not much is known about what he did there. However, the neighbors noted that the marriage of the Lalauries was exceptionally dramatic, and their separations and reconciliations were well known. The doctor did return to the Royal Street home and participated in business transactions with his wife after the separation. He was also present the day of the fire. On April 10, 1834, during the morning, the kitchen, which was an outbuilding attached to the two-story mansion, caught fire. The Lalauries' across-the-street neighbor was Judge Jacques-Francois Canage, who observed them removing valuables in case the main building also caught fire. He suggested that they, quote, "have the slaves removed to a place of safety," unquote. Dr. Lalaurie was quoted in the newspaper to have replied in an insulting tone, quote, "There are persons who would do much better by remaining at home than visiting others to dictate to them laws and the quality of officious friends." The newspaper reported that Judge did not abide by this request and instead ordered that they break down the doors. 7 tortured people were discovered, chained, mutilated, starved, and inhumanely brutalized. They brought them to the columns under the cabildo for treatment and to become a human zoo. Some accounts say 2,000 people viewed them. Some say it was 4,000 who viewed the people who received the violence of the Lalauries. Regardless, thousands of people bore witness to the violent and secret spectacle revealed by the fire at the Lalaurie mansion. Modern tours, such as that of Gallagher House nearby and the Herman Grima House on St. Louis Street, focus on the experience of the enslaved. These urban enslavement tours go out of their way to distinguish the ways in which urban enslavement was different than the plantation slavery most people are familiar with. On both of these tours, the guides explain that the enslaved on plantations were given different treatment. For instance, on plantations, they may be expected to grow their own food in small gardens they tended, while those in the city would be nourished better by the leftovers of their owners' meals, or that they would be clothed in better clothes to keep up appearances. The reasoning they both explained is that living in close quarters of the city and the expectations of their neighbors, as well as the Code Noir dictation of how enslaved should be treated, forced them to ensure that their enslaved people were well-fed and well-dressed and presentable in ways that plantation slavery did not require. However, Dr. Miles explains that, quote, "In Savannah and other southern port cities, urban slavery and rural slavery were inextricably linked, such that plantation owners had regular business in town and put their slaves to work in either location." Unquote. Either 1 or 2 of the 7 people who were rescued from the fire died shortly after. Newspapers report both. What happened to the remaining 5 or 6 people is not documented. Any stories that explain what happened to them aren't based on documented evidence. What is documented, dozens of times, across the world, was the story of Delphine Lalaurie and the fire at her mansion. I found articles from newspapers across the country and beyond, recounting the scandalous story to their readers. Many simply reprinting stories from New Orleans papers like a wire service would today. The story was told and retold for months, making it a 19th century example of a viral news story. The story has never, in almost 200 years, been cured of the virus. After the fire, the property was purchased and rebuilt in 1837. In 1894, the numbering system changed in the French Quarter, so the address was originally 282 Royal Street. The house we see today at the corner of what was formerly Hospital Street but is now Governor Nichols Street was only 2 stories when it was built. The 3rd story was added later in the 19th century, according to the Historic New Orleans collection. So that bricked-up window that Delphine chased her young enslaved girl Leah out of? More likely, it was an architectural choice or a change inside of the house that left a blocked window, since there was no 3rd story in Delphine's time. And the house burned. Delphine really did escape to Paris and live the rest of her life in exile in France. She really was buried in Paris and then exhumed and reburied in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, according to Long's examination of the documentation. The grave with a plaque discovered in the 1940s was purchased by Paulin Blanc, Delphine's son, with Jean Blanc, shortly before she was buried there. He had inherited a huge estate after his mother's death, along with his siblings, and was capable of pulling off any memorial he chose, no matter how exceptional. The plaque was misread to show her death as 1842 because of the corrosion, but she died in 1849, probably of illness. Sometimes tours will explain her death as a dramatic run-in with a boar on a hunting trip. While French death records never reveal the cause of death, she had been sick for some time, according to correspondence from her children, who lived with her in Paris. Of her 6 children, Borgia, Pauline, Laure, Jean, Paulin, and Jean-Louis, Pauline, Laure, and Paulin, and Jean-Louis all lived with her in Paris. Pauline, Laure, and Jean-Louis had been present the day of the fire in New Orleans. Paulin was studying at Princeton at the time. Neither Pauline nor Laure married. Paulin and Jean-Louis did not work while they were in Paris, so all remained reliant on their mother. This was directly resultant from the fire and reveal of the torture, according to Long's interpretation. The home has had many owners over the years and served as many different types of businesses or establishments. Individuals began capitalizing on the legends of the haunted house almost immediately, with Harriet Martineau's 1836 account in her Retrospect of Western Travel. She interviewed eyewitnesses to the tragedy. She witnessed the building still in destruction during her New Orleans visit, as it wasn't rebuilt until 1837. In 1845, it first became a school, Franklin High School. In 1862, it was purchased by a music teacher. In 1869, it became a business. In 1872, it became a school again, this time Lower Girls High School, which was a racially mixed school for girls that existed peacefully for a couple of years before white suits forced those of African descent out with no regulation from the superintendent or police. The Lower Girls High School moved in 1878 and closed in 1879. Then, the mansion became the home of the New Orleans Conservatory of Music. The location became an apartment building and was home to fruit and vegetable vendors of Sicilian and Italian descent in the 1880s and 1890s, when the French Quarter was Piccolo Palermo. In 1893, Fortunato Greco, an Italian immigrant, procured the building and soon noticed the public's interest in seeing ghosts. He is seemingly the first owner to capitalize on the haunted house. He drew crowds who paid 10 cents each. The Haunted House Exchange Saloon was opened between 1895 and 1909. Greco sold the building in 1916, and it continued as an apartment building where tenants would charge curious visitors to see the ghosts. Apparently, during this time, they would clank chains and dress in sheets to help the illusion along. In 1922, William Jennings Warrington opened a lunch house and then purchased the building in 1923. The mansion became the Warrington House in 1924, which was a shelter for men and boys experiencing homelessness. Warrington perpetuated and expanded the myths of the haunted house. Warrington sold to an organization of a 32nd degree Masons of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite called the Grand Consistory of Louisiana in 1932. But the Warrington House continued until 1942, and the Masons never used the building. It was next used as an apartment building again through the 1960s. From 1969 until 2000, it was again a private residence of a radiologist who restored the property. He sold to another out-of-town private owner who then sold to Nicholas Cage in 2006, who ended up losing it to foreclosure in 2009. It was last sold in 2010 to another private investor who renovated the building but allows it to sit empty and unopened to visitors as of this 2023 retelling. People often try to explain Delphine's extreme cruelty by pointing to trauma she could blame on people of color. Some of these reasons include her parents were murdered by the enslaved people they owned. She resented her father for having children with women of color and leaving portions of his estate to them. Or she resented women of color because her husbands had affairs with them, among others. But evidence shows that none of this victim blaming is correct. It's much more likely that Delphine was just a very typical product of her time, fulfilling the expectations of a person of her status and not questioning the harm she caused. The truths about Southern antebellum race-based slavery are so horrific that we have painted a case that went viral in 1834 as an extreme. Unfortunately, she was not extreme. She was typical. She was just exposed. It makes you question all that we have accepted in the modern times without a critical analysis that will be the horror stories of the future. Thank you for joining me on another dive into one of New Orleans' most famous ghost stories. Please like and subscribe for more stories from the deep, coming soon.